The date is March 14th of 2016. The Pi Day of 2016, also the birthday of Einstein. On this date, we have actually started a very important mission called ExoMars. On top of this beautiful Proton rocket, the Russian Space Agency, in cooperation with the European Space Agency, has launched a mission called ExoMars. Now, this is a mission that's actually kind of important because what they're actually trying to do now is find life on Mars. This is What the Math. Today we're talking about ExoMars. Welcome and enjoy the video. And for this particular mission and for this video, we're going to be using a few mods, and one of them is actually the Soviet part mod that allows us to use various rockets from the Soviet period. And here, this is actually the Soviet version of Proton, which is a little bit different from the version that was used for this launch. The modern version is called Proton M, and it's actually a little bit more technologically advanced, and it has a lot better efficiency as well. But even the older version was quite popular and actually had very powerful engines as well. So it has in the first stage it has these 6 engines around the central tank, so there's nothing in the middle here. And if we remove this, you'll see that there's 4 more engines in the second stage. Then the second stage, oops, I'm not taking the right part off. The second stage comes off, and there's another engine underneath here, which is another Proton engine known as RD0212. And this is actually a pretty small stage, which will then release the final stage, which will be our satellite for ExoMars mission. I'm going to talk about the actual satellite when we get closer to Mars, or in this case, Duna. And let's actually launch the rocket first and see how it flies, because this rocket is actually very powerful. This is one of the most powerful heavy launchers currently, because the American rockets, specifically Atlas V, that was originally supposed to be used for this particular launch, is kind of being phased out because of the expenses, because of NASA's decision to cut down on funds. They are actually trying to remove a lot of the Atlas V launches and switch to private agencies like, for example, SpaceX. Anyway, so let's start. Alright, systems check. We're going to enable RCS and SAS and prepare for launch. 3, 2, 1, and launch. Excellent. Beautiful rocket. It flies really, really well, very stable, and it's actually very efficient as well. It can deliver up to 23 tons, I believe. 23 tons of weight to low Earth orbit, and it's one of the more powerful rockets currently used. Not as powerful as some of the older rockets that NASA used before, but nevertheless, it's actually quite efficient and does have a pretty good record in terms of performance, at least. However, it did have a few failures. Although most of the failures happened with the upper stage that was not actually part of the Proton rocket, but its failure rate, the actual rocket failure rate, is only 3%. So out of about 106 missions, only I believe 3 rockets had a bit of a failure with one of the engines, but most of them actually did pretty well. Now, in terms of choices of other rockets that these agencies could have actually gone with, there isn't really that much they could have done. So there's the Proton rocket that's usually used by the Russian agency. There is a few rockets in China and India that can possibly deliver slightly less weight. And really the best choice for these agencies was Atlas V. And unfortunately, due to costs, NASA had to back away from this project, and so European Space Agency, which actually originally wanted to develop this project and really depended on NASA for this project, had to switch to the Russians. They actually decided to invite the Russian Space Agency and had them develop both the rocket itself and also the actual lander that you'll see when we get closer to the planet. And this is actually the budget cuts that were related to President Obama's administration. Unfortunately, they decided to cut down the space exploration, which is very unfortunate. Actually, that's one of the things I don't like about the Obama administration, is that they actually cut down on the funds related to space exploration. All right, stage 2. This is the one that has the 4 engines known as RD0210. These are very, very efficient. Many of the NASA rockets actually use these engines as well, or at least a derivative of these. So they've actually been developed in cooperation with the Russian Space Agency. And so these rockets on this particular rocket, or these engines on this rocket, are actually very, very popular and very, very efficient. Now, the reason why Obama administration decided to sort of stop this mission and remove the funds from it is because of the James Webb Space Telescope that NASA will be launching in 2018. And for this reason, I cannot really be upset with them, because, I mean, James Webb Telescope is a pretty awesome telescope that's going to be sort of replacing Hubble at some point. And it's a piece of technology that is going to be very, very, very important for the future of space exploration. And as part of this particular deal between ESA, which is the European Space Agency, and Roscosmos, which is the Russian Space Agency, the Russians will basically provide 2 of these Proton rockets, and they'll also provide the actual lander that is inside of this thingy. And their goal is to basically try to reach Mars and explore various methane deposits and also various methane traces that can be found in the atmosphere, because they're trying to essentially look for life on Mars. And ExoMars essentially stands for exobiology on Mars. This is the purpose of this mission. This is what they're trying to achieve, and this is their main goal. All right, so our second stage is out of fuel. Let's just check where we're going to end up. 80 kilometers. Perfect. I'm going to release our second stage. And there it goes, beautifully separated from us. And now we have our last stage here. We're going to create a maneuver node. And it's about time we also released the protective shell here. And this is what we have inside. We have our beautiful trace gas orbiter, which is this part right here that you see on the screen. But also this is what I was able to create in Kerbal Space Program. And then inside of this thing, we have our Russian-made lander that is also going to be delivering a rover that's actually inside of this thingy that I will show you when we get closer to Duna. So let's actually try to burn our engine and try to get into a circular orbit. I don't know if I'll have enough fuel here, but we might have to use a little bit of fuel from our orbiter as well, just to get into circular orbit around Kerbal. And while we're getting into orbit, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the purpose of this mission. So really the main purpose is to try to investigate various methane deposits and also methane traces that were found in the atmosphere and see where it actually came from, because methane can possibly come from a geological source. Like, for example, it can actually be formed by interaction with water, liquid water specifically, or it can come from a biological source like on Earth. But, you know, we know that there's no cows on Mars, so if it is in the atmosphere, where is it coming from? Are there actually bacterial colonies somewhere underneath the surface that are actually creating it? So this is what we're trying to discover in this particular mission. Alright, time to separate the last stage. There it goes, and we're going to also engage our last engine just to get a little bit more orbital velocity here, because I think I'm lacking a little bit orbital velocity to get into orbit. Alright, excellent. Circular orbit has been reached, so it's time for us to set course to Mars, or also known as Duna in this game, and we're going to try to then land our lander, our rover on Duna, and then this will actually try to establish an orbit around Duna. So, this is going to be our simulation of this mission to Mars. Now, so what is this thing and what is that thing? So there's a rover inside of this thing. I'm not going to remove this yet because we'll need it to land on Mars or Duna, and this part is essentially going to be responsible for orbiting around the planet and collecting all kinds of data about atmospheric methane. So both of these will be essentially looking for methane. But in this first stage of the journey that was launched on March 14th of 2016, this is essentially just a test stage. So this thing will actually function normally, but the rover is just to see if it actually even works. They're basically testing the landing apparatus that was produced by the Roscosmos, the Russians, and they're also going to be testing the rover that's kind of sticking out here, just to see if it works. So it's really only going to function for a few days and then shut down. And then the real mission will start in 2018, when they'll actually launch the much more expensive version of the rover and the much more expensive version of the orbiter as well. And so begins our transfer stage to Duna, also known as Mars. And look at that, there's actually an eclipse in the background. It's an absolutely beautiful time to do this. And so anyway, so let's talk a little bit more about this particular mission. And what I actually wanted to say is that ESA, which is obviously the European Space Agency, didn't actually want to choose the Russian rockets initially. And there's a reason for that. There's actually a good reason why they actually went with NASA, even though Roscosmos would have been much cheaper and they would have been more likely to accept this particular mission. And that's because of the, first of all, reliability of Proton rockets. So of all heavy launchers, including Atlas V, it's unfortunately the least reliable, but it's also the cheapest. It's the cheapest and it does have the highest capacity to carry things. And on the other hand, unfortunately, the Russians, or in this case the Soviets, have a very, very bad record with Mars. They're almost like cursed when it comes to Mars. They've launched something like 19 missions to Mars, and only a handful actually even made it to Mars. So I believe from all of the missions, Zond 2 in 1964 had a Mars flyby, so it actually passed by Mars, but unfortunately its radio failed, so it returned no data whatsoever, so it was a completely useless mission. Mars 2 in 1971 was an orbiter lander, similar to, I guess, to this, and it arrived in 71, but unfortunately returned very limited data, and the lander actually burned up due to a very steep re-entry, so it kind of basically crashed into the atmosphere of Mars. Mars 3 in 1971 was also an orbiter lander, and it did arrive. It actually returned limited data, and the lander operated, but only for like 20 seconds before failing. And lastly, Mars 5, which was the fourth mission that was actually able to even reach Mars, arrived in 74 and lasted only a few days. And so every single mission they had was a disaster and or partially failed and really didn't provide much data. On the other hand, NASA obviously had quite a lot of successes. As a matter of fact, even now, at least 8 of the rovers that are still on Mars can actually be reactivated and can kind of function. So Mars is technically the planet with the highest amount of robots living on it. 8, I believe, possibly 9 soon. Alright, so we're finished our burn, so now we're just going to wait until we get to Duna and then try to land on it. So the really interesting thing about this mission is that it uses a lot of really awesome new technologies. So inside of this capsule, which actually in real life is a little bit smaller than this, I had to increase the size just to put my rover in it. Inside of it is a module known as Schiaparelli, developed by the Italian Space Agency. And this particular module will be delivered using this capsule that will be demonstrating a new descent radar, a lot of really interesting computer algorithms that will be used to try to land very, very precisely and very safely. And on top of all of this, it does have engines on the bottom that will actually prevent or basically stop this particular module. And lastly, it is also going to be using a very interesting crushable material on its belly that will be used as a kind of a cushion to basically smack down on Mars in the last moment of descent. So in other words, they'll be using what's known as lithobraking. It's when you basically stop your ship using a crashing maneuver. You basically crash onto a planet. And that's actually kind of interesting. And so by October of this year, of 2016, we should actually find out if it's actually a very successful mission and if they're able to land this particular module using these really new awesome technologies. And here we are approaching Duna, and we're about, I think it's like 2 days and 4 hours away from it. So in real life, what will happen is, at this point, the Schiaparelli will be released, and we can actually see Duna right there, and this particular orbiter will start using its maneuvering engines to try to get into a position where it can use air braking to get into orbit. That will take it actually a few months, but it will try to get into orbit around Duna, but do it very, very gently and very slowly. It's going to be a circular orbit very, very high above the surface of Duna. Or Mars. But Schiaparelli will actually go directly for an intersection with Duna, and so what it'll be doing is essentially crashing or crash landing onto Duna using its really interesting descent module that we'll be using in a few minutes. And to get into orbit, the orbiter will actually have to move around Mars a few times. As a matter of fact, it's going to take it up to a year to get into a stable 400-kilometer orbit above the surface of Mars in order for it to essentially start detecting methane in the atmosphere. And so this mission is actually really interesting because not only is it using a lot of really cool technologies, but its purpose is essentially to literally find life on Mars, or at least figure out where all of this methane that we actually discovered on Mars is actually from. So that's basically what this mission will be about. Now, the actual rover, when it lands in 2018, is going to have a very, very large drill that will drill deep down into the Martian soil and will then try to collect some kind of information or data about where the methane is coming from, or possibly even collect some sort of a microorganism that is responsible for producing methane on Mars. And that's essentially the ultimate goal of this mission, to see and possibly detect some kind of a microorganism or any kind of life that may be producing these methane molecules. And here is Duna. So what we're going to do now is perform an aerobraking maneuver and try to get into a circular orbit around it. So we need to retract the panels and also retract our communication device. Communotron 8888 is what it's called. And we're going to try to basically slow down enough for the orbiter to get into orbit and then release the Schiaparelli and land it on the surface of Duna. And here we go. This is the aerobraking maneuver. We're going to try to slow down just a little bit so that we can then put the orbiter into orbit around Duna, and Schiaparelli will then be released and land on the surface. And I think mission is complete. We have slowed down just enough to get into a relatively elliptical orbit around Duna. And essentially, this is kind of what the orbiter will be doing, except that it's going to do this a few times until it gets its apoapsis down to about 400 kilometers. And then it's going to reestablish a circular orbit around Mars and stay in that orbit for a very, very, very long time. Now, in our case, what we're going to do next is we're going to basically release Schiaparelli when it gets here, and it's going to land on Duna, whereas the orbiter is just going to continue its adventure and stay in a relatively circular orbit around Duna. And we're approaching Duna again, and this time we're going to release Schiaparelli, we're going to release the landing module, and basically control everything from here. This is going to be our landing module that is going to be landing on Duna. Now, like I said before, in reality, this will be released about 3 days before the approach to Mars, but because I didn't put any batteries in it, I totally forgot about the solar panels, we just have to do it this way, because this is really the only way for us to land successfully and also safely on Duna without really destroying anything. So let's just wait for us to get into the atmosphere. It will actually position itself and very likely use its heat shield as it's supposed to be used. Basically, it will actually be facing this way toward the atmosphere, which also means that we should be absolutely fine when we're entering Duna. Now, in this particular game, usually you don't need a heat shield to land on Duna, but I wanted to include it just for the sakes of realism, and because it will, in reality, when you land on Mars, you do need to bring a heat shield, because even though the atmosphere is very thin, it will still be hot enough for you to actually worry about overheating. So we're going to just wait until we get closer to the atmosphere here. We're going to warp to that point. And now that we're actually entering Duna atmosphere, I'll get to show you what this lander will be doing when it tries to land on the surface of the planet. I don't have any parachutes, and we're basically going to be using these engines right here to try to land safely. We also don't really have any lithobraking maneuvers here like the real Schiaparelli module, but we will be landing quite safely and then releasing our beautiful rover on the surface of the planet. So let's see how this goes. So let's just wait a few more seconds, a few more minutes until we enter the thicker part of the atmosphere, and then the fun begins. Alright, here we go. ExoMars is entering the atmosphere of Duna. We're going to start slowing down because this heat shield is actually really good at slowing you down, and because of its shape, it will slow down the orbital speed very, very fast and quite dramatically, and we'll be basically landing somewhere on the bright side of Duna, hopefully somewhere on a flat region of this beautiful planet. So here we go. Our speed is currently 1180 meters per second. We're slowing down really fast, and we are actually quite safely will be landing on the surface. I'm only going to enable my engines when my speed is below 400 meters per second, since I only have about 1300 delta V in this particular ship. I need to save as much as I can for a very slow and very safe landing. And I'm also going to start looking at the altitude here and engage my engines at an altitude of approximately 10, possibly 9 kilometers. So I think, yes, so we're definitely going to be landing. And, oh no, is it going to be the dark side? I don't want to land on the dark side. And looks like our orbiter is going back into orbit now, and we'll be able to actually control it afterwards. When it gets to its apoapsis, we'll try to establish a circular orbit later on. But for now, let's just worry about Schiaparelli, and let's try to land it somewhere where it's not too dark, because I do have solar panels inside of this thing. And I do need to actually use them, because my electrical levels, my electricity will actually run out relatively soon. So let's see if we can maybe slow down our orbital speed a little bit more by just doing this, moving back and forth, and possibly land somewhere in this region here, not too far from the sun, which is, where is the sun? There it is. We need to make sure that we have some light when we land, because otherwise we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Our lander will actually be unable to use some of its functions. And it's really interesting how we're actually slowing down as we're going. And so the descent profile here is absolutely brilliant. I'm actually really slowly approaching the planet, and this is a pretty safe maneuver, to be honest. Now, I can go down to about 400 meters per second and to about 10 kilometers before even worrying about engaging my engines. So right about now, I think, as soon as I see rocks in the bottom, there we go, I see some rocks there, I'm going to start blasting my engines now. And I still have like 1000 delta V, so I don't have to even worry about this too much. But this will allow me to really gently have a beautiful touchdown on the surface of Duna in a relatively nice location, it looks like. Yeah, this is a pretty flat, for Duna at least, location that we have below us here. Alright, so let's slow down to about 50 meters per second, and then turn the engines off and wait until we get to slightly lower part of the atmosphere. I'm going to watch my altitude here. At around 1000 meters, I'm going to blast the engines again, because these three engines are actually relatively powerful. Even though they look so puny and tiny, they're actually quite strong. Alright, so let's slow down again. We're going to go at 50 meters per second now. And the rocks are already visible. Okay, so let's just start slowing down, and we're going to go down to about, maybe about 20 meters per second, maybe 10. There we go. This is perfect. So now we're just going to slowly descend down to the surface and have a very gentle, almost perfect touchdown. And you can kind of see the altitude dropping here, and my fuel, there's quite a lot of fuel left. So this is going to be just awesome. I mean, I didn't expect this to be such an interesting and such a really unique, but at the same time powerful lander. Of all landers I could have created, this is actually one of the better so far. Alright, let's increase speed again. And we're going to touch down at something along the lines of 3 meters per second. And here we go, 2 meters per second, and boom, look at that, beautiful. All right, and welcome to Duna, or Mars. Anyway, so let's remove this last canopy, and there we go, that's our rover. Nothing to sing songs about, but it does have a few interesting apparatuses here. So it has a thermometer to measure temperature, which we can do right now. A recorded temperature from the environment, good job. We also have this thingy, which is the surface scanning module, which is basically kind of like for me to simulate that we're going to be looking for methane. So we've performed the analysis of ore, And lastly, we have a seismic accelerometer, which obviously tests for earthquakes, or in this case, dunaquakes. Now, we're still stuck to that thing, so we're actually going to remove ourselves from this, and let's see how this goes. Every time I do this, or sometimes when I do this, things don't go very well. This is actually probably the trickiest part. So, ready, steady, and boom. Okay, well, that was better than nothing. And here we go. We're gonna roll down the hill now. That's nice. I do have panels here, so I need to actually open them up, extend the panels, and let's hope we don't crash into anything. We may have to use our brakes here. And so this is our rover, and the real rover looks something like this. It's very, very similar to what you see on the screen, but I guess not as mine is not as cool as theirs. But mine has a lot more panels, and mine has an ability to jump as well. So there you go. And we also obviously have a really cool camera that we can use to take pictures of beautiful surface of Duna. So this is what Duna looks like from this really cool rover on the surface of this really beautiful, really strange, really unusual, but really, really awesome planet. So that's all I wanted to do today. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about ExoMars mission that essentially started on March 14th of 2016 and will culminate and finish sometime in 2018 when they actually launch the real rover that will then look for life or the source of methane on the surface of Mars. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to like it, and don't forget to share with someone who you think likes Kerbal Space Program or likes to talk, listen, and read about various space missions and space in general. There's more missions coming in the future. There's going to be more Kerbal Space videos as well. And obviously there's other games as well that I often use to explore various space topics. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next video, and game you later. Bye-bye. And for those of you who are interested in supporting this channel, don't forget there is a Patreon page that I started recently, and thank you so much for those of you who have already supported me. I'll see you guys in the next video, game you later, and as always, bye-bye. And goodbye to you, Duna. You're such a beautiful planet. You're actually one of my favorites.